The May sun rose gently over Denver, washing the city in a soft, golden light. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the beam slipped through the curtains of a modest two-story home and brushed against the face of Grace Miller. She stirred slowly, opening her eyes to the warmth of the morning. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. Today was no ordinary day. Today, her son was coming home. She pushed herself up from the bed and sat for a moment, savoring the silence. Downstairs, she could already hear the faint rustle of a newspaper, the sound of pages being turned with casual indifference. Richard Miller, her husband, was already awake, settled into his armchair in the living room. Grace could picture him there without even looking, legs crossed, glasses perched on the end of his nose, coffee in hand, his attention consumed by the daily news. When she finally came down the stairs, the sight confirmed her imagination perfectly. Richard hardly looked up when she entered. "Morning," he muttered, not bothering to put down the paper. "Good morning," Grace replied softly, her voice carrying more energy than his. She moved past him into the kitchen, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. She poured herself a cup, the steam rising like a quiet promise, and leaned against the counter. Her heart was light but restless. Today Ethan was coming home. Her son. Her pride, the boy who had grown into a man almost too quickly, was returning from college for the weekend. But he wasn't coming alone. He was bringing someone with him. Chloe Sanders. The name felt foreign on Grace's tongue, yet it carried a weight that stirred her curiosity. This was not just a friend, not just another classmate. Chloe was the girl Ethan had introduced as his girlfriend. Serious enough, he had said, that she was worth meeting. It was the first time Grace would see the young woman who had captured her son's heart. The thought sent a rush of nerves through her. Would Chloe like her? Would she be polite, warm, respectful? Would she understand the kind of family Ethan came from? Grace wanted everything to be perfect. She had even made reservations at a restaurant downtown, deciding that such an occasion deserved more than a simple meal at home. As she stood in the kitchen, sipping her coffee, memories began to rise unbidden. She could still see Ethan as a toddler, stumbling across the living room floor on unsteady legs, his arms outstretched toward her. She remembered the first day of school, when he clutched her hand so tightly, his backpack far too large for his small frame. She remembered late nights at the kitchen table, helping him with homework, his brow furrowed in concentration. And she remembered the day he left for college, when she hugged him goodbye at the station, blinking back tears as he promised he'd call every week. It all came rushing back, as if time itself had folded in on her. And now, here she was, about to meet the woman who might one day be her daughter-in-law. She set the cup down, straightened her posture, and began to plan. The tablecloth she would use later, the flowers she would buy, the outfit she would wear, something elegant but not overwhelming, something that said, "I'm glad you're here," without trying too hard. Every detail mattered. She wanted Ethan to see that she supported him, that she welcomed his choices, even if the thought of losing his undivided attention made her heart ache. "Grace," Richard's voice cut through her thoughts. He still hadn't looked up from the paper. "Don't stress yourself. They're just kids coming for a visit." "Not just a visit," Grace answered firmly. "This is important for Ethan. And for us." Richard sighed and turned another page. To him, perhaps it was just another day. But for Grace, it was a turning point. She moved back upstairs and opened her wardrobe, carefully considering each option. Her fingers brushed against a soft blue dress she hadn't worn in years. She held it up against the mirror, imagining the evening ahead. For a moment, she saw herself not just as a mother, but as a woman stepping into a new chapter of life. Yet beneath her excitement ran an undercurrent of fear. Change was coming. She could feel it pressing against the walls of her heart, as if the house itself hummed with anticipation. She tried to shake it off, telling herself she was only nervous because she wanted everything to go well. But deep down, she sensed something more, a whisper that life was about to tilt, that nothing would remain as it was after today. For now, though, she clung to the joy. She walked back to the window, opened the curtains wide, and let the sunlight flood the room. The city stretched out before her, alive and glowing, as if welcoming her hopes. It was a peaceful morning, a morning that seemed to promise nothing but happiness. Grace Miller, standing there in the warm glow, had no way of knowing that within hours her world would begin to unravel. The afternoon sun slanted across Denver, painting the living room in warm, lazy stripes. Grace stood before the mirror in her bedroom, holding a blouse against her chest, debating whether it looked too formal. She wanted to strike the right balance, elegant but approachable. Tonight mattered. She was about to meet the young woman who might one day be her daughter-in-law. She had just smoothed the fabric over her arm when the phone rang. At first, the sound seemed ordinary, just another call interrupting her day. But as she picked up the receiver, she caught the clipped urgency in the voice on the other end. "Mrs. Miller," a man asked quickly, "this is Denver Emergency Services. Your son, Ethan Miller, has been in an accident. He's being transported to Denver Health Medical Center. You need to come immediately." The words crashed over her like a wave. Grace's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't even respond. Her fingers trembled so violently the phone nearly slipped from her hand. What do you mean?" she stammered. How bad is it?" "I can't provide details over the phone, ma'am, but his condition is critical. Please make your way to the hospital right away." The line clicked dead, leaving Grace staring at her reflection in the mirror, her skin drained of color. The blouse slid from her hand, crumpling onto the floor. "Downstairs!" Richard looked up from his paper as she rushed into the room, pale and shaking. "Grace? What is it?" he asked, confused. "It's Ethan," she gasped, struggling for breath. "He's been in an accident. They're taking him to Denver Health. They said it's critical." For a second, Richard froze, as if his mind couldn't process the words. Then he stood abruptly, the newspaper tumbling from his lap. "Let's go," he said, his voice tight, though his eyes still carried the dazed look of disbelief. The drive blurred into chaos. Richard gripped the wheel, pushing the car faster than he ever had, while Grace clutched her seatbelt, her knuckles white, her prayers spilling out in frantic whispers. The wail of sirens cut through the city air, red and blue lights flashing past them as they raced toward the hospital. Each moment stretched like an eternity, the world narrowing down to the beating of Grace's heart and the terror clawing at her chest. When they arrived, the emergency entrance was a storm of motion. Ambulances lined the curb, paramedics unloading stretchers, their voices sharp with command. Grace stumbled out of the car before it had even fully stopped, her legs unsteady, her eyes scanning wildly. She saw Ethan, her Ethan, being wheeled inside. His face was ashen, his head bandaged, tubes and wires snaking around him. "Ethan!" she cried, but the paramedics didn't pause. They rushed him through the double doors, disappearing into the fluorescent-lit corridors beyond. Grace pushed forward, her heart hammering, only to be stopped by a nurse at the desk. "Ma'am, please, you need to check in here," the nurse said firmly. Richard caught up, placing a steadying hand on Grace's shoulder, though his own face was pale. "Our son," he said hoarsely. "Ethan Miller. He was just brought in." The nurse nodded briskly and gestured toward the waiting area. "He's in trauma. The doctors are working on him. Please wait here. Someone will update you as soon as possible." The waiting room was chaos. Families huddled together, some weeping, others staring numbly at the floor. The air smelled of antiseptic and fear. Somewhere down the hall, a baby wailed. Further away, a woman sobbed uncontrollably. Grace sank into a chair, her body trembling, while Richard paced nearby, running his hands through his hair. Minutes dragged by like hours. Then a police officer entered, his hat in his hand, his expression grave. He approached them with careful steps. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller?" he asked. Grace's stomach dropped. She gripped the armrests, unable to speak. Richard answered for them. "Yes." The officer cleared his throat. "I'm very sorry to inform you that Ethan's passenger, Miss Chloe Sanders, did not survive the crash. Her family has already been contacted. I thought you should know." The words hit Grace like a blow to the chest. She covered her mouth with both hands, muffling the cry that tore from her throat. Chloe gone. The girl Ethan had been so eager for them to meet. The one he had spoken of with such light in his eyes. Gone just like that. Tears blurred her vision, and she shook her head in disbelief. Richard stood stiff beside her, muttering something under his breath, but Grace couldn't hear. All she could think of was her son, lying somewhere beyond those doors, fighting for his life, while the young woman he loved was already lost forever. The hallway buzzed with voices. Gurneys rattled across the floor. Alarms beeped in the distance. But for Grace, the world had gone silent, save for the echo of the officer's words. The first wave of tragedy had struck, and she knew, with a hollow certainty, that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. The hours after the accident bled together in a haze of harsh lights and endless waiting. Grace sat in the stiff hospital chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Each time the doors to the trauma bay swung open, she looked up, her heart lurching, hoping for some sign, some shred of news about her son. Finally, a doctor emerged, a tall man in green scrubs, his surgical cap still on, his expression grave. He walked toward Grace and Richard with a clipboard tucked under one arm. Grace shot to her feet before he even reached them. "Mrs. Miller?" "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice calm but heavy. "I'm Dr. Patel, one of the trauma surgeons on call. Your son, Ethan, sustained a severe traumatic brain injury in the collision." Grace's chest constricted. The words rattled around in her skull, sharp and incomprehensible. "He's in a coma right now," Dr. Patel continued. The CT scan showed diffuse swelling of the brain. "There's concern about intracranial bleeding. We're monitoring his intracranial pressure closely. At this point, there's no surgical intervention that would guarantee improvement. Our primary approach is supportive care, ventilation, sedation, and time. The next 24 to 48 hours are critical." Grace swayed, reaching for the back of the chair to steady herself. It felt as if the floor had tilted beneath her. "So, what are you saying?" she whispered. "That there's nothing you can do?" "We are doing everything we can," Dr. Patel assured her, his tone steady. "But the truth is, with injuries like this, there are limits. We will repeat imaging, watch for changes, and adjust treatment. For now, the best course is to wait and see how his body responds." The words landed like stones in her chest. Wait and see, as if her son's life were dangling on a thread of chance. Richard, who had remained seated, finally spoke. His voice was flat, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the doctor. "Let the professionals handle it, Grace. They know what they're doing." Grace turned on him, her eyes blazing through a blur of tears. "That's all you can say?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Our son is lying in there, fighting for his life, and you can't even look me in the eye? You can't even show that you care." Richard shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "Yelling won't change anything," he muttered. "The doctors have it under control." "Under control?" Her voice rose, ragged with disbelief. "Do you hear what they just said? There's no control. We're supposed to sit here and do nothing while our son, our only child, might never wake up." A tense silence followed, broken only by the distant hum of machines and the shuffle of nurses' shoes across the linoleum floor. Dr. Patel cleared his throat gently. "I understand how difficult this is," he said softly. "We'll keep you updated on every change. But right now, the most important thing you can do for Ethan is be here. Talk to him. Hold his hand. Even if he can't respond, we believe patients in comas can sometimes hear voices, feel touch. It can make a difference. Grace nodded faintly, swallowing against the lump in her throat. Can I see him now? The doctor gave a small nod. Yes, he's in the neuro ICU. A nurse will take you. Moments later, Grace found herself walking down a corridor lined with beeping machines and curtained rooms. The air was cool, sterile, filled with the faint smell of antiseptic. When she stepped into Ethan's room, her breath caught. Her son lay motionless in the hospital bed, a ventilator tube taped to his mouth, wires attached to his chest, monitors tracking each fragile beat of his heart. His head was wrapped in white bandages, a stark reminder of the violence of the crash. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator was the only sign that life still clung to him. Grace moved closer, her knees trembling. She reached for his hand, startled at how cold it felt in hers. She lowered herself into the chair at his bedside, pressing his fingers to her lips. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's Mom. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." Her tears fell freely now, dripping onto the starched sheets. She tried to imagine that he could hear her, that somewhere deep inside, her words might reach him. Behind her, Richard lingered near the doorway, arms folded, his expression unreadable. He didn't move closer. He didn't touch his son. Grace looked back at him once, her eyes burning, and then turned away. She couldn't bear his detachment, not when her heart was tearing itself apart. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against Ethan's hand. "Please, God," she whispered through the sobs. "Don't take him from me. I can't lose him. Not like this." The monitors beeped steadily, indifferent to her plea. Somewhere in the room, the ventilator sighed mechanical and cold. Grace closed her eyes, clinging to her son's still hand, as though her touch alone could tether him to the world. In that moment, nothing else existed, no husband, no hospital walls, no time. Only a mother and her child, balanced on the razor's edge between life and death, waiting for a miracle that might never come. 3 weeks passed, each day stretching into the next, like an unbroken chain of gray. Outside, spring deepened into summer, but inside the sterile walls of Denver Health, time seemed frozen. Ethan Miller remained in his hospital bed, motionless, tethered to machines that breathed and beat for him. The doctors reported no significant change. He was stable, they said, but still deeply comatose. For Grace, life became a narrow tunnel of hospital corridors and dimly lit rooms. She had taken an indefinite leave from work, telling her supervisor she couldn't focus on anything except her son. Every morning, she arrived before the sun, and every night she left long after it had set, often returning to collapse into bed only to dream restless dreams filled with alarms and flashing monitors. Her body bore the marks of exhaustion. Dark circles etched beneath her eyes, her clothes hung looser on her frame, and her once steady hands trembled whenever she tried to sign paperwork or lift a cup of coffee. There were nights she sat at Ethan's bedside, staring at the steady blip of the heart monitor, until her vision blurred and she realized she had been crying without tears. She had shed so many already that her body seemed unable to produce more. Richard came by only sporadically, once every few days, sometimes less. When he did appear, it was brief, a few perfunctory questions to the nurses, a glance at Ethan, a muttered word to Grace. Then he was gone again, back to his routines, back to the comfort of home. Grace stopped asking why. Each time he left so quickly, a wall grew higher between them. She couldn't understand how he could detach himself when their son lay between life and death. The marriage, already fragile, began to fracture openly. Grace no longer hid her resentment. One evening when Richard appeared, she asked, her voice raw from lack of sleep, "Do you even care? Do you understand that every second he lies here feels like my heart is being cut open?" Richard avoided her eyes, muttering something about not being able to live at the hospital. His excuses only deepened the ache. Grace realized with painful clarity that she was alone in this vigil. The days fell into a numbing routine. Doctors' updates that offered no new hope, brief conversations with nurses who tried to be kind, whispered words to Ethan as if her voice might guide him back to her. She read aloud from his favorite books, played recordings of music he once loved, and told him stories from childhood, as though clinging to the belief that some part of him could still hear her. But when night fell and the hospital grew quieter, despair pressed and heavier. Grace would sit in the hard plastic chair by his bed, her hands gripping his limp one, and whisper prayers into the void. She begged God for mercy, for strength, for even a flicker of change. But the monitors answered her with their steady, indifferent rhythm, a cruel reminder that nothing shifted. On one particularly heavy afternoon, Grace wandered outside the hospital for air. She sank onto a bench near the entrance, her body folding into itself with exhaustion. Around her, other families gathered, some laughing in relief, others embracing loved ones who had just been discharged. She watched a young boy hobble past with crutches, his parents smiling, their faces lit with gratitude. The sight twisted something deep in her chest. Why not Ethan? Why not her child? She felt like an outsider to joy, trapped in a world where hope belonged to others. Her gaze drifted upward to the clear blue sky above Denver, a sky that seemed to mock her with its brightness. For her, there was no light, only the relentless weight of waiting. Her hands clenched in her lap as she fought the rising tide of hopelessness. She had thought she understood pain before, but this was different. This was endless, suffocating. Every passing day without change chipped away at her spirit, leaving her hollow. She had no tears left to cry. She had no words left to pray. Only silence and the endless echo of machines keeping her son alive. As she sat there on the bench, numb and weary, Grace felt as if the world had already moved on without her. Families went home. Patients healed. The city pulsed with life. And she remained, frozen in grief, tethered to a bed in the ICU where her son lay unmoving. This was despair in its purest form, lonely, unrelenting, and absolute. The hospital had become so familiar to Grace that she could recognize the cadence of the nurses' voices, the hum of machines, and even the creak of the same chair she sat in each night. Days blurred together, each one a copy of the last, marked only by Ethan's unmoving chest rising and falling with the ventilator. One afternoon, while standing near the nurse's station to refill her coffee, she caught fragments of a conversation between a young nurse and a physician. Their voices were hushed, but the words carried just enough to reach her. "That man up in the mountains," the nurse whispered. "They say he's helped people when medicine couldn't." The doctor gave a skeptical laugh. "You mean Samuel Rivers?" Grace healers and mountain mystics don't belong in a hospital conversation. That's folklore, not science. The nurse shrugged, unbothered. "Tell that to the families who swear their loved ones walked out after meeting him." Grace froze, her paper cup suspended halfway to her lips. Samuel Rivers. The name lodged itself in her mind. She turned slowly, as if afraid that even acknowledging it might make the thought vanish. For hours, she tried to push it aside. She told herself she was a rational woman, that her son needed doctors, not superstition. Yet the words refused to leave her. By evening, as she sat beside Ethan's bed, she found herself whispering the name under her breath, testing its weight in the silence. Samuel Rivers. The following day, she overheard more. In the cafeteria, a woman at the next table spoke softly to another visitor. Grace couldn't help but listen. "My niece was born with severe cerebral palsy," the woman said. She couldn't walk, couldn't even sit up straight. The family was desperate. Last year, they took her to this man in Colorado, Samuel Rivers. He prayed over her, placed his hands gently on her back. A month later, she was taking her first steps with braces. Doctors couldn't explain it. The other visitor gasped. "That's impossible." I saw it with my own eyes, the woman insisted. She's in school now, walking, laughing. I don't care what anyone says. Something happened that day. Grace felt her pulse quicken. She stared at her untouched food, her mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. Part of her recoiled. Surely this was just rumor, just people clinging to hope in the face of despair. She had lived her entire life trusting medicine, doctors, and evidence. But another part of her, the mother who had sat vigil for weeks watching her son hover on the brink, leaned forward, desperate. By the time she returned to Ethan's room, she was trembling. She sat down and took his limp hand in hers. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do anymore. The doctors say we just have to wait. But I can't watch you like this any longer. If there's even one chance, one tiny chance, that someone could help you, how could I not try?" She bowed her head, her forehead pressing against his hand. The logic that had anchored her all her life wavered beneath the weight of grief. What did it matter if others called it foolish? What did it matter if there was no proof? If there was even the faintest possibility of bringing Ethan back, she had to take it. That night, she lay awake in the stiff chair, staring at the sterile ceiling tiles. Her thoughts circled endlessly, but they always returned to the same conclusion. A mother could not afford to ignore hope, no matter how fragile. By morning, her decision was made. She would find this man. She would find Samuel Rivers, wherever he was hidden in the mountains of Colorado. If there was even a 1% chance, she would grasp it with both hands. Grace looked at her son's still face, her voice steady though her heart quaked. "Hold on, Ethan. I'm going to find a way." For the first time in weeks, the despair in her chest cracked, and through the fracture slipped the faintest glimmer of something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. Grace had spent the morning making calls, chasing whispers about Samuel Rivers. She asked nurses, pressed for details, even called a small parish in the foothills of the Rockies, hoping someone could confirm the healer's existence. Each attempt left her with more questions than answers. By noon, her nerves were frayed, her coffee cold at her side. Exhausted, she stepped outside the hospital lobby for air. The Colorado sky stretched wide and endless above her, brilliant blue against the rising peaks in the distance. She stood there, her arms wrapped around herself, wondering how she would ever find this man when a familiar voice called her name. "Grace." She turned sharply, startled. Standing only a few feet away was James Carter. His hair was peppered with gray now, his suit impeccably pressed, but his eyes, the same warm hazel she remembered from college, held both surprise and recognition. For a moment, Grace was too stunned to speak. "James? James Carter." He smiled, the kind of smile that softened the hard edges of the world. "I thought that was you. It's been what? 20 years. Her throat tightened. She had not expected to see anyone from her past today, least of all James. He had been the steady, kind presence during her university years, the one who always helped her carry books, who stayed up late talking philosophy over cheap coffee. And then life had swept them in different directions. She into marriage and motherhood, he into business and, clearly, success. "I didn't think you lived in Denver," she said, her voice tentative. "I've been here a while," James replied. "My firm's headquarters moved to the city about a decade ago. But what about you? What are you doing here?" The question hung between them, heavier than he realized. Grace's lips trembled before she answered. "My son. He was in an accident. He's been in a coma for weeks." James's expression shifted instantly. The warmth in his eyes turned to sorrow. "Grace, I'm so sorry." He stepped closer, his voice quiet but certain. "Is there anything I can do?" The words unlocked something in her. For weeks, she had carried the weight alone, with Richard absent or indifferent. Now here was someone who cared enough to ask, someone who hadn't already closed himself off. She hesitated only a moment before speaking. "There's someone I need to find. His name is Samuel Rivers. People say he's different, that he's helped people when medicine couldn't. I don't know if I believe it, but I can't stop thinking about it. If there's even a chance he could help Ethan, I have to try. James studied her for a long moment. Then, without hesitation, he nodded. Then, let's find him. Whatever it takes. Grace blinked, surprised by the certainty in his voice. You'd really help me? After all these years? Of course, James said simply. You don't have to do this alone. Later, they sat across from each other at a small cafe near the hospital. The clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversation filled the space, but for Grace, the world narrowed to the man sitting opposite her. She wrapped her hands around a mug of coffee, grateful for its warmth. Richard doesn't understand, she admitted softly. He comes by sometimes, but it's like he's already given up. I've been living at the hospital, waiting, praying, but he just drifts further away. I feel like I've been carrying this alone. James listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers. You shouldn't have to carry it alone, he said. She shook her head, her voice catching. I don't even recognize my marriage anymore. We used to be partners, but now it feels like I'm invisible. The confession left her both ashamed and relieved. She had bottled it up for so long that speaking the words felt like exhaling after weeks of holding her breath. James leaned back, his expression thoughtful. He remembered nights in the library long ago, watching her laugh at some small joke, seeing the way her eyes lit when she spoke about the future. Back then, he had wanted to tell her how much she meant to him, but fear had held him back. And then she had married Richard, and he had buried those feelings. Now, looking at her across the table, tired, worn, but still radiant with quiet strength, he felt those old emotions stir again, tempered by years of distance and respect. I remember you, he said gently. You were always the one who believed in people, even when they didn't deserve it. That hasn't changed. Grace lowered her gaze, a faint blush coloring her cheeks despite the heaviness in her heart. For the first time in weeks, she felt seen. As they left the cafe, James walked beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence steadying her. For the first time since Ethan's accident, the crushing loneliness inside her eased. She still didn't know where this path would lead, or whether Samuel Rivers even existed, but she no longer felt like she was facing the impossible alone. There, in the heart of Denver, Grace discovered something she hadn't expected to find. Not just hope for her son, but the quiet, undeniable comfort of companionship. 2 days later, Grace found herself in James Carter's car as it wound its way out of Denver and into the Colorado high country. The city gave way to open plains, then to foothills rising steadily against the horizon. Soon the road began to climb, curving along steep ridges where pine trees stood like silent sentinels. Grace pressed her hand to the window, watching the forest blur past. Snow still clung to the distant peaks, their white crowns piercing the blue sky. Streams rushed alongside the road, swollen with meltwater, glinting like silver ribbons in the sunlight. Each turn carried them deeper into a world that felt older, quieter, and infinitely removed from the sterile walls of the hospital. The drive was long and winding, the road narrowing until it seemed barely wide enough for 2 cars. At times, Grace gripped the edge of her seat, her nerves stretched taut. But James remained steady at the wheel, his focus calm, his voice occasionally breaking the silence to point out landmarks he remembered from past business retreats in the mountains. His confidence steadied her more than she realized. After several hours, they reached a small mountain village tucked between towering evergreens. Smoke curled from chimneys, and children's voices echoed faintly through the crisp air. The scent of pine and wood smoke mingled, sharp and grounding. It was there, at the edge of the village, that Grace saw what she had only imagined until now. A line of people stretching along a dirt road, all waiting patiently before a modest wooden cabin. The sight made her chest tighten. There were dozens, perhaps more than 100, men, women, and children, bundled in coats, some leaning on canes or crutches. Families sat on blankets, holding food, keeping vigil. She caught fragments of whispered prayers, the murmur of hope spoken in many voices. Grace stepped out of the car slowly, her breath catching in the mountain air. She had expected something quieter, maybe even secretive. But this looked like a pilgrimage. "They've all come for him," she whispered. James nodded, his gaze steady. "Looks like it." For a moment, Grace's doubt surged. What if this was nothing more than a show? What if Samuel Rivers was just another man taking advantage of the desperate? She thought of Ethan lying in that bed, unresponsive, and of Chloe's family grieving their loss. She couldn't bear to be deceived, not when the stakes were so high. "This could be a scam," she said quietly, her arms wrapping around herself. "People will believe anything when they're desperate. What if I'm wasting precious time? What if I'm just fooling myself?" James placed a hand gently on her shoulder, grounding her. "Grace," he said, his voice low but certain, "I can't tell you what's true and what isn't, but I do know this. Sometimes faith is the first step toward anything good. You've carried the weight of despair for weeks. Maybe it's time to let hope carry some of it." She looked up at him, her eyes stinging. "And if it's false hope?" He didn't flinch. "Then at least you tried. At least you'll know you left nothing undone for your son." The words settled deep within her, quieting the storm of doubt. She turned back toward the line of waiting people. There was something undeniable in their faces, weariness, yes, but also a kind of unshakable belief. Mothers holding sick children, elderly couples leaning on each other, young men staring straight ahead as though they had no other lifeline left. As Grace and James moved toward the end of the line, the mountain air grew colder, carrying with it a sense of gravity she couldn't quite explain. She shivered, not from the chill, but from the weight of the moment. This was it. After weeks of despair, after countless sleepless nights, she stood at the threshold of something unknown. Whether it was miracle or myth, she didn't yet know. But as she joined the line of believers stretching toward the wooden cabin, her heart thudded with a mix of fear and fragile hope. And with James by her side whispering softly, "Sometimes belief is the beginning of a miracle," she allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to believe that something extraordinary might still be possible. When at last their turn came, Grace stepped forward with James beside her. The wooden cabin looked plain from the outside. Weathered logs, a simple porch, a door marked only by a small wooden cross. But as she pushed it open, the air shifted. The scent of pine and wax hung heavy, mingled with something indefinable, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Inside, the room was spare, almost austere. A single wooden chair sat in the center, candles flickering on a table against the wall. And in that chair sat the man she had heard so much about, Samuel Rivers. He was not what Grace had imagined. No flowing robes, no dramatic gestures. Just a man in his late 50s, his posture straight, his face weathered by years, his eyes dark and steady. Yet those eyes, so deep, so unflinching, seemed to pierce straight through her. For a moment she faltered, her breath catching. She had expected to feel either skepticism or relief. Instead, she felt exposed, as though every secret thought and unspoken fear within her had been laid bare. Samuel raised a hand, beckoning her closer. His voice, when he spoke, was low and resonant, carrying a weight that seemed to vibrate in the air. "You carry sorrow," he said, "but not only for your son. Your marriage is hollow. Your husband is not the one who will walk with you until the end." Grace's heart lurched. She had not spoken a word about Richard. Yet Samuel had named the truth she barely dared admit to herself. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She simply stared at him, trembling, as though he had reached into her chest and plucked out her deepest wound. Beside her, James shifted uneasily. He glanced at Grace, watching the color drain from her face, then back at Samuel, his own expression taut with disbelief and awe. Samuel continued, his gaze steady. "Your son lies between this world and the next. The doctors cannot guide him back, but I will come to him. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. I need time to prepare. 3 days. Grace found her voice at last, small and breaking. And then you can help him. Samuel inclined his head. I can open the door, but he must choose to walk through. Until then, you must keep your faith. Do not waver. Light candles. Pray. Hold fast to the belief that he will return. Doubt is the enemy that will steal him away. Grace swallowed hard, tears burning behind her eyes. Candles, she repeated. Simple ones, Samuel said. Buy what you can. And keep something sacred with you. A cross, a medal, anything that ties your spirit to the divine. Place it where you can see it when fear rises. Let it remind you of the promise that despair is not the end. She nodded slowly, the instructions sinking into her like lifelines cast across dark water. Strange as it seemed, the idea of holding something tangible, of lighting a flame against the darkness, brought a fragile comfort. Still, part of her recoiled. This was not medicine, not science. Could she really believe that prayer and ritual could succeed where doctors had failed? Yet the conviction in Samuel's voice was unshakable, his words carrying the calm authority of someone who had seen what others could not explain. I don't know if I can be that strong, she whispered. You already are, Samuel replied gently. You came here. You sought me. That is strength. For the first time in weeks, Grace felt her heart steady, if only a little. A strange calm washed over her, not the absence of fear, but the presence of something sturdier beneath it. Hope. James stood, quietly taking it all in. He had come to support her, skeptical but willing. Yet, as he watched Grace kneel slightly, bowing her head in gratitude to Samuel, he felt his chest tighten. There was something extraordinary about her. This woman who had endured heartbreak, who carried exhaustion etched into her face, yet still clung fiercely to the chance of her son's survival. He realized then what he had always known but never spoken back in college. Grace was stronger than anyone gave her credit for. Stronger, perhaps, than she knew herself. When they left the cabin, the mountain air hit Grace like a baptism, sharp and clean. She clutched her coat around her, her mind reeling from the encounter. Samuel's words echoed in her ears, mingling with the wind in the trees. Your husband is not the one who will walk with you until the end. Beside her, James placed a steady hand on her back, guiding her down the steps. Are you all right? He asked quietly. Grace drew a shaky breath, then nodded. I don't know what to believe, but for the first time in weeks, I feel something I thought I'd lost. Hope, James offered. She looked at him, her eyes glistening, and whispered, yes. Hope. 2 days after their meeting in the mountains, Samuel Rivers arrived at Denver Health Medical Center. Grace had been pacing the corridors since dawn, her nerves wound so tightly she thought she might break. When she finally saw him walking through the glass doors, tall, composed, with that same calm intensity in his eyes, her breath caught. He was dressed simply, a dark coat against the sterile white walls, his presence drawing curious glances from staff and patients alike. Grace hurried to meet him, James trailing close behind. You came, she whispered, her voice trembling. Samuel inclined his head, as promised. Before approaching Ethan's room, Samuel asked to speak briefly with the attending physician. Dr. Patel, still skeptical, met him outside the ICU. Grace held her breath as the two men exchanged quiet words. Samuel did not argue or insist. He simply explained that he was here as a spiritual advisor, to sit with the boy, nothing more. After a pause, Dr. Patel relented, agreeing under the hospital's policy for chaplains and spiritual visitors. Grace led Samuel into Ethan's room. The machines hummed steadily, monitors blinking in their rhythm. Ethan lay as he had for weeks, pale and unmoving, the ventilator hissing with each mechanical breath. Samuel walked to the bedside, his movements deliberate, reverent. He pulled a chair close and sat. Without fanfare, without a single dramatic gesture, He took Ethan's limp hand in his own. His eyes closed, his head bowed. The room grew utterly still. Grace stood frozen near the wall, her chest heaving. James shifted beside her, but said nothing. For nearly an hour, Samuel remained like that, silent, unmoving, his hand wrapped around Ethan's, as though anchoring him to this world. His lips moved occasionally in prayer, but the words were too soft to catch. Time seemed suspended. The monitors continued their steady beeping, indifferent to the tension that filled the air. Grace felt tears well in her eyes. She clasped her hands together, silently begging God to let this mean something, to let this moment change what the doctors could not. At last, Samuel opened his eyes. He released Ethan's hand gently, stood, and turned toward Grace. His expression was serene, his voice steady. "He will live," he said simply. The words struck Grace with the force of a revelation. She staggered back a step, her hand flying to her mouth. "You're sure?" she whispered. Samuel nodded once. "Give him time. You will see." Then, without ceremony, he left the room. Grace followed him into the hallway, overwhelmed. "Thank you," she managed to choke out, but he only inclined his head again, as though the gratitude belonged elsewhere. The next 2 days were agony. Grace hardly slept, her eyes fixed on her son's face, searching for any sign. Nurses came and went, adjusting IVs, checking monitors, whispering about the unusual visitor they had seen. The doctors remained cautious, repeating the same refrain, "No change yet." But on the morning of the second day, everything shifted. Grace was dozing lightly in the chair by Ethan's bed when she felt the faintest movement. She jerked upright, heart pounding, and saw his eyelids flutter. "Ethan!" she gasped, leaning forward. His chest rose unevenly, a rough cough escaping past the ventilator tube. Alarms began to chime, and within seconds nurses rushed in. One of them called for Dr. Patel. Grace's tears blurred her vision as she clutched Ethan's hand. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." Dr. Patel entered quickly, scanning the monitors. His eyes widened. "Get respiratory, we're pulling the tube. He's trying to breathe on his own." Grace watched, trembling, as they carefully removed the ventilator. Ethan coughed again, his throat raw, but then he took a breath. A ragged, imperfect, but unmistakably his own breath. And then, slowly, his eyes opened. For a moment, he seemed dazed, his gaze wandering. Then his eyes found hers. "Mom." His voice was hoarse, broken by weeks of silence, but it was there. Grace let out a sob that tore through her body. She pressed her forehead to his hand, clutching him as though she might never let go. "Yes, baby, yes, it's me. You're back." Behind her, Dr. Patel stared at the new CT scans in disbelief. The swelling had diminished dramatically. The traces of bleeding were gone, as though they had never been there. I can't explain this," he murmured to a nurse. "This shouldn't be possible." Grace heard none of it. She was weeping openly now, tears falling onto the sheets, her whole body shaking with relief. After endless weeks of despair, here was her miracle. Her son's eyes open, his voice calling her name. Later, when Samuel reappeared at the hospital entrance, Grace ran to him. Overcome, she dropped to her knees before him, her sobs breaking the quiet of the corridor. "Thank you," she cried, her voice raw. "Thank you for giving me my son back." Samuel bent slightly, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Do not thank me," he said gently. "Thank the one who gives life. I was only a vessel." His words only deepened her tears. She pressed her palms together, bowing her head, unable to find more words. James helped her to her feet, his own eyes shining as he watched the woman he had once admired crumble into gratitude and awe. In that moment, surrounded by the sterile walls of a hospital, Grace felt something holy. The despair that had consumed her for weeks shattered, replaced by a radiant certainty. Her son had been returned to her. This was the miracle she had prayed for, the silent miracle that no one could deny. The days following Ethan's awakening were filled with cautious celebration. Nurses checked on him constantly. Therapists evaluated his strength, and doctors shook their heads in disbelief each time new scans came back cleaner than the last. For Grace, every hour felt like a gift. She sat by his side, holding his hand as though it were a lifeline, whispering thanks she hadn't been able to say in weeks. Ethan was weak, his muscles stiff from weeks of stillness, but his eyes were clear, his voice slowly regaining strength. On the third day, as sunlight filtered through the blinds, he turned to his mother and whispered, "Mom, I need to tell you something." Grace leaned in, brushing his hair gently off his forehead. "Anything, sweetheart." "When I was asleep, or wherever I was," Ethan began, his eyes glistening, "I saw Chloe." His voice caught, and for a moment he was silent. She wasn't sad. She wasn't in pain. She told me it wasn't my time. But she also told me something else. Something for you. Grace's breath hitched. "For me?" Ethan nodded. "She said you deserve to be happy, that you've given everything, and it's time for you to live again. She said, don't let the past chain you. Find the life you were meant to have." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She pressed her forehead against his hand, overcome. "Oh, Ethan!" When she lifted her gaze, she found his eyes steady on hers. "Mom, I know things with Dad aren't right. They haven't been for a long time. I don't want you to stay in a life that hurts you. If Chloe's words weren't enough, let mine be. You should be free." His words pierced her heart. For years, she had buried her discontent, convincing herself that endurance was duty. But now, hearing her son, her miracle, say it with conviction, she knew the truth could no longer be denied. That evening, when Richard finally appeared at the hospital, Grace met him with a calm she hadn't felt in years. He stood stiffly at the foot of Ethan's bed, asking a few detached questions before muttering about work. Grace watched him, and in that moment, the hollowness between them became undeniable. "Richard," she said, her voice steady, "this marriage is over." He blinked, startled, as though he hadn't expected her to say the words aloud. "Grace, don't do this now. It should have been done years ago," she interrupted, her tone firm. "Our son almost died, and you were never truly here. I won't waste what's left of my life in silence and emptiness. Ethan and I deserve more." Richard's mouth tightened, but he offered no fight. He only nodded curtly, turned on his heel, and left. The finality of his footsteps echoing down the corridor was strangely liberating. James was there later that night, standing quietly by the window as Grace settled back into her chair beside Ethan. When she looked up, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. He had been there through the darkest days, steady and unwavering, and she realized she was no longer afraid of leaning on him. Days later, Samuel Rivers returned one last time. He stood at the foot of Ethan's bed, his expression serene. Grace rose to thank him again, but he lifted a hand gently. "I told you," he said, his voice low and sure, "that your sorrow would not last forever. Your soul will sing instead of weep." Grace's throat tightened. "You were right. You gave me back my son." Samuel's gaze softened. "No, life gave him back to you. I was only the bridge. Now you must walk forward." With that, he took his leave, disappearing into the tide of hospital visitors as quietly as he had arrived. Grace knew she might never see him again, but his words would remain etched in her heart forever. 2 weeks later, the doctors declared Ethan well enough to go home. The morning of his discharge was clear and bright. Grace wheeled him through the corridors, the scent of antiseptic giving way to fresh air as they emerged through the sliding glass doors. The city stretched before them, bathed in the glow of early sunlight. Denver was alive, cars passing, people hurrying to work, the world oblivious to the miracle that had just unfolded inside those hospital walls. Grace paused on the steps, her hand on the wheelchair handles, and looked up at the sky. The sunlight warmed her face, spilling over her like a benediction. Beside her, Ethan tilted his head back, eyes closed, breathing deeply as though reclaiming the world he had nearly lost. James waited nearby, offering a quiet smile, not pressing, simply present. Grace's heart stirred with something fragile but real, a promise of love, not the reckless kind of youth, but the steady, patient love that comes with time and understanding. She let the moment sink in, the weight of grief and despair finally lifting. Her marriage was over, but her life was not. She had her son. She had hope, and she had the strength to begin again. Together, mother and son stepped forward into the morning light. The shadows of the past lay behind them, and though the scars would never fully fade, they no longer defined the path ahead. It was at last a new dawn. I was 12 the first time I saw Samuel Brooks. He'd just moved into the house next door, a small white bungalow with peeling shutters and a fence that leaned ever so slightly to the left. Fairview was the kind of town where front porches were always swept, lawn signs told you who to vote for, and secrets traveled faster than mail. Within hours of his arrival, the rumors began to bloom like mold in humidity. "That's the man from the Givens case," whispered Mrs. Platt, clutching her cardigan like it could protect her from whatever evil she imagined. "The one who went to prison for assaulting a neighbor. A teacher, no less." I had no idea what the Givens case was, but my mom clearly did. That evening, as I reached for my bike helmet to ride before dinner, her hand shot out like a trap, grabbing my wrist so tight it left faint red imprints. "You don't go near that house," she said. Her voice, usually calm, sing-song soft, had dropped to something sharp and foreign. Not the fence, not the sidewalk, nothing. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to understand why someone dangerous would be allowed to live across from the neighborhood park, next to a family with a toddler, in a community where even mailbox height was debated at HOA meetings. But the look in her eyes froze the words in my throat. This wasn't up for discussion. Over the next few days, I noticed things no one else seemed to pay attention to. Mr. Brooks, always Mr. Brooks to my parents, like naming him gave him weight, never approached anyone. He didn't wave when people jogged past, didn't chat over hedges or accept welcome pies. He spent hours in his backyard tending a garden so meticulous it looked like a catalog spread. Tomatoes staked like soldiers, sunflowers reaching for symmetry, each row labeled with handwritten signs tucked into the soil. He kept his porch light on until 3:45 p.m. every weekday, exactly when my school bus dropped me off. The moment I stepped onto our driveway, it would click off like a switch had been triggered. When the mail-well truck refused to walk packages up to his porch and instead flung them from the curb, nobody blinked. When parents called their kids inside the second he stepped into his yard, they didn't hide the urgency in their voices. It was as if the ground he walked on was contaminated. Some of the neighbors went further. Mrs. Caldwell, whose retirement plan included keeping the neighborhood moral, created a spreadsheet labeled Activity Log Brooks Household and assigned shifts. Every time he left, returned, or got a package, someone would write it down. No one ever knocked on his door to introduce themselves. No one asked questions. They just watched and whispered. The strangest part was how little Mr. Brooks gave them to document. He left every evening at 7:30 sharp, always in the same beat-up navy blue truck, dressed in the same utility jacket embroidered with Fairview salvage. He returned around 6 o'clock in the morning, parked quietly, and disappeared inside. On weekends, he was in the garden. But the moment a child wandered out with sidewalk chalk or a stray basketball bounced too close, he vanished, as if the sound of children sent him back into hiding. At first, I believed the adults. I avoided the sidewalk in front of his house, took the long way to the bus stop, and quickened my step when his porch light was on. But then, small things began to unravel the story, like the day the Jefferson twins tried to follow me home from school, throwing pine cones and yelling names, and he suddenly appeared by his mailbox, pretending to adjust a latch. The boys turned and bolted without a word. Or the time our sprinkler timer malfunctioned, and Mr. Brooks walked over the next day with a replacement battery, saying only, "Your system's corroding. Might want to check the valves." My mom slammed the door after accepting it. "He's trying to ingratiate himself," she muttered. "That's what predators do. They get close before they pounce." But I'd seen something else entirely. He hadn't tried to come inside. He hadn't lingered. He'd handed over the battery and walked away, like someone who wanted to help but knew he'd never be trusted. I started watching from my bedroom window more deliberately, not out of fear, but confusion. The man everyone warned me about didn't act like a monster. He acted like a ghost. Quiet, faded, always retreating before someone could shout. And yet always watching. Always at the right place, the right time, when I needed someone to notice. It was early October when the storm finally broke. The sun had already dipped behind the hills that cradled Fairview, and the air was crisp with the kind of chill that hinted winter wasn't far off. I'd stayed late at the library, lost in a book I wasn't supposed to be reading, To Kill a Mockingbird, ironically. It was getting dark by the time I started the walk home, but I wasn't worried. Not at first. The shortcut behind the mobile station was faster, and I'd taken it dozens of times before. But that night the air felt heavier. I heard the voices before I saw them. Well, if it isn't little Lila," someone sneered. Jake Horn and his two shadows, Ben and Tyler, stepped out from behind the dumpsters like a scene rehearsed too many times. Jake was already a junior despite still being in middle school. Shaved head, leather jacket, and a reputation for cruelty that even teachers pretended not to notice. He shoved me hard against the brick wall. My backpack hit first, then my shoulder. I winced. "You lost?" he asked, fake concern dripping from his voice. "Leave me alone," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. Ben laughed and grabbed my backpack, unzipping it like it belonged to him. My books spilled onto the pavement, one landing in a puddle of something that smelled like rotten oil. "Ah, is this your precious science project?" Tyler teased, lifting a packet of papers and tearing it in half with a slow, deliberate smile. Jake leaned in close enough that I could smell the gum on his breath. "Maybe you need a little lesson in manners." I don't know what I would have done. Probably cried, maybe tried to run. But then, from behind the rusted dumpster, a voice. "Problem here." It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But something about the tone, calm, measured, almost bored, made the three boys freeze mid-smirk. Samuel Brooks stepped out of the shadows. His hands were in his coat pockets. He wasn't holding anything. He didn't even look angry. But Jake's face drained of color. "And no problem, sir," he stammered, his voice suddenly cracking. Tyler stepped back, dropping the torn paper. We were just leaving. Samuel didn't say another word. He didn't have to. They scattered like roaches, their sneakers slapping against the pavement as they ran toward the streetlight. For a moment, the alley was silent again. Samuel looked at me, not with pity or disappointment, but something else, a quiet sort of sadness. He crouched slowly, picking up my books one by one, shaking off dirt with care. "Are you hurt?" he asked. I shook my head. The wall had scraped my shoulder, but that didn't matter. "Good," he said softly, handing me the last of my papers. "You should get home. It's not safe here after dark." I wanted to thank him, but the words tangled in my throat. He turned to leave without waiting, heading back toward the dumpster, his shoulders hunched like he carried something heavier than groceries or garbage. When I got home, my mom was just finishing dinner. One look at the tear in my jacket and the dirt on my hands, and she exploded into full-on panic mode. "What happened? Did someone hurt you? Why didn't you call me?" I told her mostly. The library, the boys, how someone had shown up and scared them off. I didn't say who. She sighed, dabbing antiseptic on my palms with too much force to be comforting. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. You're too trusting, Lila. There are dangerous people out there." The irony sat on my tongue like poison. The man she feared most had just saved me from 3 actual threats. He hadn't asked for anything. He hadn't told me to keep a secret. He hadn't even told me his name. He just helped. But the next day, the truth caught up with me. When I got home from school, my mom was waiting in the kitchen, her arms crossed and her jaw tight. "Mrs. Platt saw you talking to him," she said, her voice low and trembling with fury. "Lila, I told you to stay away from that man." "He helped me," I said. "He didn't do anything wrong. Don't you dare defend him." Her voice cracked like a whip, and I flinched, not because she scared me, but because I'd never heard that tone from her before, not even when Dad left. "He is dangerous," she said. "He's a convicted felon. Do you even know what he did?" I didn't. Not really. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I believed her. After that, something inside me shifted. I didn't stop thinking about Samuel Brooks. Not because I was scared of him, but because I couldn't stop wondering why someone everyone called dangerous had risked stepping into that alley for me. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't threatened. He hadn't demanded thanks. He just showed up and left. My mom wouldn't let it go. She called Reverend Moss that evening. And by the next day, I found myself sitting in the church office under the gaze of framed Bible verses and faded family photos. Reverend Moss was a kind man with deep laugh lines and tired eyes. He'd baptized me as a baby and brought us meals after my dad left. But now he looked serious in a way that made me feel like I'd already done something unforgivable. "Lila," he began gently, "people like Mr. Brooks, they don't look like monsters. They don't wear signs. They look helpful. They pretend to be helpful. That's how they gain a child's trust." He pulled out a pamphlet from a drawer, illustrated warnings about predatory behavior, smiling adults, uncomfortable kids, a checklist that felt both obvious and terrifying. They rescue. They protect. Then they offer things, rides, snacks, a safe place. That's how they get close. I swallowed hard, but he didn't offer me anything. He didn't ask me to go with him. He didn't even smile. Reverend Moss nodded slowly. "That's exactly how they work. Patient, calculated. They make you feel safe. Then, when you let your guard down—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. When we got home, Mom sat me down at the table, her expression caught somewhere between fury and fear. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Lila. He has conditions, parole restrictions. He's not even allowed to speak to minors without supervision. If someone reports this, he could go back to prison." "But he didn't do anything wrong," I insisted. "He just helped me." "That's not the point," she snapped. "The point is you disobeyed me, and you interfered with a dangerous man's parole. You could have been hurt. Or worse." I nodded. I apologized. I promised to stay away. But I didn't stop watching. I began documenting everything. At first, it was just little things: when he left for work, when he came home, how often he watered the sunflowers. But soon patterns emerged. Samuel left every night at 7:30 sharp. He always wore the same navy jacket with Fairview Salvage stitched into the chest. His truck had a dented bumper and a cracked taillight. He drove straight down Harper Avenue, toward the industrial part of town. He returned at dawn, always alone. On weekends, he stayed home, worked in the garden, tended to the porch, trimmed the hedges. But the moment any neighborhood child appeared outside, he disappeared like a shadow retreating into light. He never played music, never had visitors, never received phone calls loud enough to hear from outside. It was starting to feel less like hiding guilt and more like avoiding accusation. And yet, something else caught my attention. His garden. It wasn't just in the center of his backyard, like most people would place it. He'd positioned it with surgical precision, angled to face the street, and more importantly, facing the 2-story brick house 2 doors down, Dr. Calvin Monroe's house. Dr. Monroe was the opposite of Samuel Brooks in every way. He was charming, outgoing, smiled too much. He ran community parenting nights and handed out flyers on child psychology. He offered free tutoring on Thursdays. Parents adored him, and Samuel Brooks never stopped watching his house. I tested it one Saturday morning. I brought a book outside and sat on the porch swing, deliberately facing his yard. I wanted to see what he'd do. Sure enough, within 5 minutes, the curtain in his living room shifted. I looked up just in time to catch the edge of his profile as he peered toward the street. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. But when a white van I didn't recognize drove slowly past our block, he moved, slipping from one window to the next to keep it in view. When the van circled back, he stepped outside, leaned against the porch column, and didn't blink until the vehicle turned the corner. Only then did he disappear again. Later that day, I told my mom about the van. Her expression twisted immediately into alarm. What kind of van? What color? Who was driving? I mentioned Samuel had been watching it too. Her face hardened. He was probably the one in that van earlier. Predators case neighborhoods. That's what they do. It didn't make sense. Why would a predator scare himself off? Why would someone spend every Saturday silently tracking the same house across the street while making sure the neighborhood kids stayed out of sight? Why did this all feel backwards? And why, when I thought about what had happened in that alley, did I feel safer with the man everyone feared than I did with the boys everyone ignored? I couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Monroe's house. It always looked perfect. Red shutters, white trim, freshly mowed lawn. Parents came and went like clockwork, dropping off their kids for enrichment sessions or adjustment counseling. On Thursdays, you could see a line of minivans parked along the curb. Jenny Harmon, my friend from school, went there twice a week. She said he gave her snacks and let her play with therapy dogs. Her mom called him a gift to the neighborhood. But every time I saw Dr. Monroe laughing with parents, Samuel Brooks was somewhere nearby, watching. It was becoming hard to ignore. I decided to test one more thing. That Thursday, instead of walking straight home from school, I took the long way, cutting through Riverside Park. It was a known spot for older kids who smoked behind the tennis courts or skipped school under the gazebo. My mom had forbidden me from going there alone, but I needed to know. I barely made it past the swings before I heard them. "Look who wandered into the woods," Jake said, flicking his cigarette to the side. His voice was low and smug. Ben and Tyler flanked him like wolves. I kept walking. "Oh, don't be like that," Tyler called. "We were just wondering if you needed someone to walk you home. You know, since you like dangerous men and all." They started closing in. My palms went cold. I could see the edge of the street through the trees, but it felt miles away. Jake stepped in front of me. "What's the matter, Lila? Scared? Maybe you should scream. I bet that freak next door will come save you again." I turned to run, then froze. Footsteps. Behind me, steady and unmistakable. "There's my neighbor," Samuel said, his tone casual, almost friendly. "Ready to head home, Lila?" Everything stopped. Jake blinked. Ben backed up. Tyler lowered his phone. "We were just talking," Jake muttered. "Sure you were," Samuel said, not raising his voice. "Let's go, Lila." I didn't say a word. I just moved. We walked in silence until we reached the sidewalk, out of sight of the park. Then he stopped. "That was reckless," he said quietly. "You put yourself in danger to see if I'd show up." I stared at him. "How did you know I was there?" He looked straight ahead. I didn't. "I was walking to the store and heard your voice. Recognized it." "You said I could ask," I blurted. He paused. "Yes, I did. Why does everyone say you hurt a kid?" He didn't answer right away. The street was silent. A dog barked in the distance. A lawn sprinkler clicked to life down the block. Then he said, "Because I did hurt someone, but not the way they think." Before I could ask what that meant, my mother's voice rang out from our porch. "Lila Marie Raymond, get away from that fence now." She stood there, phone in hand, face pale with fury. I was just inside. Now. I followed her in, heart thudding. That evening, she sat me down like I was about to be sentenced. I've called Reverend Moss. He's calling the sheriff's office. What you did was dangerous, not just for you, but for him. He's not allowed to talk to you. You could send him back to prison. But he didn't. This is not up for debate, Lila, she snapped, and her voice cracked. Not from anger, but something closer to fear. You're a child. He's a convicted felon. And you have no idea what these men are capable of. Do you understand me? I didn't answer. Because no, I didn't understand. If Samuel was a predator, why did he go out of his way to avoid kids? Why did he flinch every time one came near? Why did he spend so much time watching, not them, but Dr. Monroe? If he was grooming me, why didn't he ever try to get close? Why did he seem so tired all the time, like he'd been holding up the sky and no one else even noticed? That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. And that's when I heard it, shouting. I scrambled to my window and pulled the curtain just enough to see. 3 men stood in Samuel's front yard, shadows in the porch light. They were yelling, their bodies tense. "We know what you did," one shouted, shoving him backward. "Kids aren't safe with you here," another barked. Samuel didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't run. "We should take care of this now," the third man growled, "before he hurts anyone else." I wanted to scream, to do something, but I couldn't move. Samuel looked up, straight at my window. Our eyes met, and for the first time, I saw it. Not guilt, not fear, just exhaustion. The kind of weariness that comes from being hated for something you didn't do, and not having the strength to fight it anymore. "I've never hurt a child," he said, his voice low but steady. "I never would." They didn't believe him, but somehow, I did. The next morning, our mailbox had something taped to it. A plain white envelope. No name, no stamp, just 2 sentences written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Fairview Tribune, March 18th, 2019. Check the archives. The real story is there. I stared at the note for a long time before slipping it into my backpack. That afternoon, while Mom was busy in the laundry room and the house smelled of detergent and wet cotton, I snuck out. I rode my bike to the downtown public library, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. Mr. Green, the reference librarian, raised a gray eyebrow when I asked for help with the microfilm machine. "School project," he asked. "Kind of elite." He guided me to an old, humming machine in the back corner and left me alone. I scrolled through articles, fingers trembling on the dial, until I found it. March 18th, 2019, page 3. Local man sentenced for assault on registered sex offender. My breath caught in my chest. The man was Samuel Brooks. The victim, Brian Givens, had been a respected member of his old neighborhood. Sunday school teacher, volunteer tutor, former camp counselor. The article was vague. It said Samuel had reported Givens multiple times, raising concerns about disturbing patterns involving children. But when nothing was done, Samuel confronted him directly. The fight left Givens hospitalized. 3 broken ribs, a shattered wrist, and a concussion. Samuel was arrested, charged with felony assault, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. I kept reading. Buried beneath the fold was a quote from Detective Marla Kingsley. While Mr. Brooks' actions were unlawful, his persistence likely prevented further victimization. Several minors have since come forward with allegations against Mr. Givens. I clicked through the database. There were follow-up articles. 17 children. 17. They'd been attending Givens' reading club and mentorship program. For years, he'd used his position to isolate and abuse them. Samuel had seen it. He'd reported it. He'd begged authorities to investigate. When no one listened, he acted, and they sent him to prison. My chest tightened as I printed every article I could find. It wasn't just assault. Samuel had built a case. documenting license plates, tracking behavior changes in the kids, recording who came and went. He even submitted evidence to child services, but no one moved. Because he wasn't a cop, he wasn't a parent, he was just a neighbor. The moment I got home, I laid the stack of articles on the kitchen table. Mom walked in, paused, and frowned. "What's all this?" "Read it," I said. She did. She read in silence, mouth tightening, hands beginning to shake. Halfway through the second article, her lips parted. By the fourth, she sat down. By the last one, she was crying. "Oh my God," she whispered. "We got it wrong. We got it so wrong." She looked at me, her voice hoarse. "That man, he went to prison trying to protect children, and we treated him like a monster." I nodded. "There's more," I said quietly. I showed her the page about Brian Gibbons, the connection to Dr. Monroe. They'd corresponded. Letters. Prison visits. Gibbons had called Monroe his successor. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. The man we'd trusted. The man who ran parenting workshops and offered free counseling. The man who hugged children at the community fair. He was Gibbons' student. That night, for the first time in my life, I saw my mother walk across the lawn and knock on Samuel Brooks' door. I watched from the window. He answered, and she handed him the printouts. They spoke for several minutes. She cried. He didn't. When she came back inside, her eyes were red. I asked what she said. "I apologized," she replied simply, and told him I was ashamed. What did he say? That he understood. That fear makes people do cruel things, and that he didn't blame us for wanting to protect our kids. It broke something in me to hear that. He didn't blame us, even after we'd blamed him for everything. It didn't take long for the neighborhood to fracture. Some people, like my mom, couldn't read the articles fast enough. Others refused to believe them. Mrs. Platt, who had led the safety watch with military precision, insisted the stories were fake. "Anyone can forge a newspaper article," she said, lips thin with denial. He probably planted them. But when Reverend Moss contacted his law enforcement friends in Portland and confirmed everything, even Mrs. Platt fell silent. 1 week later, Fairview police raided the house 2 doors down from ours, Dr. Calvin Monroe's house. They seized hard drives, photographs, envelopes. They uncovered letters written to and from Brian Gibbons, recordings, diaries, counseling logs that had been doctored to explain erratic child behavior. And worst of all, they found names. 12 children from our neighborhood. Jenny was one of them, the girl who'd gone to tutoring twice a week, the one who used to braid friendship bracelets on my porch. She stopped speaking for weeks after the raid. As the investigation unfolded, one thing became painfully clear. Someone had been watching Dr. Monroe, documenting, recording, building something airtight. That someone was Samuel Brooks. When Detective Kingsley stood in front of a crowd of reporters, she said what no one else had dared to. Mr. Brooks provided the foundational evidence that allowed us to pursue this case. He's been tracking Dr. Monroe for nearly 3 years. His files contain time-stamped photos, vehicle logs, audio transcripts, and surveillance data that filled in the gaps we couldn't reach. She held up a thick manila envelope, the corner worn from use. He built a better case than we did. That night, I walked into Samuel's backyard as sirens wailed just down the street. He stood by his garden, arms folded, not triumphant, just still. "You knew," I said softly. "This whole time you knew." "I suspected," he replied, "from the day he moved in." "Why didn't you report him?" "I did, multiple times. But no one listens to the guy with a record when the predator wears a smile and a suit." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "So you just watched." "I watched. I gathered. I waited. And I tried to make sure no one else got hurt while I did." His voice cracked slightly. "Do you know what it's like to see kids in danger and not be able to stop it? Not because you're wrong, but because no one will believe you." I didn't. Not then. But I do now. Over the following weeks, Fairview turned upside down. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid Samuel now brought pies and apology letters. He didn't turn anyone away, but he didn't ask for their forgiveness either. Mrs. Platt was the first to knock. "I ruined your life," she wept. "I made everyone fear you." He only said, "You were trying to protect your grandkids. I can't fault you for that." The city wanted to honor him, an award, a ceremony, a plaque. He declined. "I didn't do it for recognition," he told my mother. "I did it because kids deserve to be safe." 3 months later, a for sale sign appeared in his yard. He said it wasn't because of hate he'd had enough of that. It was because he'd finally found something he'd been searching for all along. Peace. The day he moved out, he left me a letter. "Lila, thank you for being brave enough to look for the truth when everyone else stopped trying. You asked questions that mattered. You trusted your eyes, not the noise. You reminded me that silence isn't always safety, and sometimes children see what grown-ups won't. Keep asking. Keep listening to your gut. Keep choosing curiosity over comfort. That's how change begins. Stay safe. Samuel P.S. I left something for you in the garden. Behind the sunflowers, I found a small metal box buried beneath the soil. Inside, a photo of Samuel in uniform, much younger, standing with a group of soldiers in front of a tan stone wall marked Afghanistan, 2009. And next to it, a brand new bike lock and a key. So you can ride without fear. Kids shouldn't have to worry about monsters, especially when the real ones don't always look like monsters at all. They tore down Dr. Monroe's house that spring. In its place, the city built a park. There's a small plaque beneath the swings that reads, "In memory of courage, for those who speak up when no one wants to listen." Now I'm 25, a social worker. I investigate abuse claims and listen to voices people dismiss. And every time I step into a case that no one wants, I think of Samuel Brooks, the man we feared, the man we judged, the man who saved us all.